Thank you all for coming. Welcome to my history class. I was expecting a few more students, so I hope that the older folks among us will not be too bored, but we'll give it a shot. Today, we're going to do an archaeological dig into the early days of computer animation. We'll screen my 3 films, Calculated Movements, 2 Space, and 378. And we'll also look at clips from a few other works too. All of these works were made between 1974 and 1985, a decade of rapid technological change. In fact, each work was produced on a completely different system. We'll take a look at the technology and see how each work was made. Let's begin by looking at one of the films. This is 2 Space. I'll describe the making of this film, 2 Space, but since this is my origin story, let's start at the beginning. The story begins in 1970 in St. Louis, Missouri. When I was a freshman at Washington U, I wasn't quite sure what I would study. In high school, this was my favorite book, mathematics, and geometry was my favorite subject. So when I got to college, I assumed I'd major in mathematics. After I flunked my first course in calculus, I had to reconsider that assumption. I considered computer science. To find out about computers, I took a course in programming where I learned how to compute grade point averages in Fortran. I didn't find that very interesting. In fact, it was bloody boring. And so my interest in geometry led me to major in architecture. While I was studying architecture, I was exposed to some experimental films by Jordan Belson and Norman McLaren. Today, short films are available everywhere on YouTube and Vimeo, but at the time, they were much more obscure, and these were a revelation. Like most people, I only known film as a storytelling medium. I had no idea that film was also being used as a medium for fine art. I went out to find more about these artists. And I found Jordan Belson's work written up in a book called Expanded Cinema by Gene Mundbud. In Expanded Cinema, I also discovered an LA film artist by the name of John Whitney. John Whitney was using computers to generate animation from mathematics as a new form of art. Computer graphics was in its infancy and completely unknown to the general public. I thought the idea of animating geometry with a computer was astounding. It was the ultimate expression of geometry as art. I had an epiphany and decided that computer animation was what I wanted to do. I just needed to find out how to do it. But how? This was a decade before computer graphics would be taught in any hard school. There wasn't even a single textbook on the subject yet. I knew something about programming, but nothing about how images were generated. The only thing to do was to track down this filmmaker, John Whitney, and ask him how it's done. Maybe he would let me apprentice with him. So I moved to Los Angeles to study filmmaking at Cal Arts and to find out from John Whitney how computer animated films were made. When I met Whitney, I asked him if he would sponsor an independent study with me so I could learn computer animation. He was totally willing to do this, but he wasn't working on a project at the moment because he didn't have access to a computer. In that Paleolithic era, before computers became small enough to carry around in our pocket, they were giant behemoths that were only found in large institutions. If you wanted to make art with a computer, you needed a patron, someone in charge of a research lab at a university, or a company that was in the computer business. You needed a systems administrator that would grant you access to their computers when they weren't being used for other so-called legitimate purposes. In other words, in the middle of the night or on weekends when no one else was around. Whitney had already had some success with this approach. He made his film Permutations with support from IBM. Matrix 1 and 2 he made at a research lab at California Institute of Technology, and Matrix 3 he used the computers at a company called Triple I. But at that point in time, when I met him, he was between computers. John said he had a proposal in and he would let me know when he got his next project started. So while I was waiting for John to get a hold of a computer, I went out to look for a computer on my own. And as luck would have it, I discovered that a professor at CalArts had already made an arrangement with NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab to give CalArts students time on their computers. There was only one student taking advantage of this arrangement, so I drove right in and joined him. The mainframe computer at JPL was a UNIVAC 1108, which was programmed in Fortran, which fortunately I knew something about. And, as it turned out, graphics was not that complicated. There were special graphic commands for drawing points and lines that were easily invoked from within a Fortran program. While most terminals connected to the UNIVAC were alphanumeric, to draw images, you needed a special graphics terminal that would respond to those graphic commands. This was the era of vector graphics, and the problem with the vector display was that when you drew a line, the glow of the phosphor disappeared immediately, and you couldn't see your whole drawing all at once. To solve this problem, they developed the storage tube. On a storage tube display, lines drawn on the screen would remain until the whole drawing was finished, and then the screen could be cleared all at once for the next frame. This is the storage tube drawing a single frame. With a storage tube terminal, I could preview my images individually while I developed my program. But when it came time to produce animation, I needed a way to get the images onto film. For this, I needed a film recorder or plotter, like this one. Inside this film plotter cabinet is a small computer that reads data from the magnetic tapes and draws images on a CRT display in that bay over on the left. If we look closer at that bay, we see a small graphics display at the bottom where the images are drawn, and at the top is an animation camera that records the images onto film. The computer lab at JPL also had a processor for developing the film, but I actually never saw any of this equipment. It was all operated by the JPL staff. I just ran my program from a terminal, and a few days later, a roll of 35mm film would appear in my mailbox, which was in a building at the entrance to the JPL campus. This is a roll of 35mm movie film. Today, film is rapidly going extinct, being displaced by digital video. But at the time, it was the primary medium for animation because it was the only way you could record one frame at a time. Once I got the developed film, I could look at it on a Moviola film editing machine and then finally see what my animation looked like. The JPL campus is located in Pasadena on the other side of LA from CalArts, so it was a bit of a trek to get there. So that I wouldn't have to commute from CalArts out to Pasadena, I rented a teletype terminal and a modem and called the JPL computer over the phone. I dialed the computer with the phone and put the receiver into the modem, and then my teletype was connected to JPL. course, the output from the teletype was text only, so I couldn't see any images from there. I just relied on the printed output as much as I could to be sure that my programs were running correctly. When I was satisfied that the program was correct, I ran it in graphics mode. In graphics mode, the program wrote the graphics commands to tape at the JPL. Then the operators took the tapes to the film plotter for recording onto film. Then they developed the film and left it in my mailbox at the front desk. With this arrangement, I only needed to make the trip out to JPL to pick up my film, which I did about once a week. This whole process of debugging graphics with the teletype and seeing the animation once a week was brutal. I knew that better systems than this existed. This was far from state-of-the-art, even for 1974. But I figured that before I could go out to solicit computer time from another, better facility, I would need to have some work to show. So I just slogged my way through to a finished film. The film was called First Fig, and here will be a short excerpt. So I finally had my first computer animated film finished. I wasn't particularly happy with it, but I had learned computer animation and I had something to show. While I was in the middle of production on First Fig, Whitney called to say he was given access to the computers at III again. III was the computer company where he had made his last film, Matrix 3. But this time around, they couldn't provide him with a programmer like they had on Matrix 3, and he wanted me to come program for him. Whitney didn't actually program himself. He always collaborated with a programmer to make his films. I had learned enough about computer animation from making First Fig that I could serve as his programmer. At III, we worked on their flagship product, a film plotter, a better and more modern version of the film plotter I had used at JPL, but it is the same basic idea. Drawing commands were read from data tapes to control the display and the camera. Usually, the data tapes were created on the big computer and brought over to the plotter for drawing onto film. But the algorithms needed for John's work were simple enough that they could be programmed directly on the small computer built into the plotter. The output from the film plotter was only black and white. To get a color image, John rephotographed the animation through colored filters, layering it over itself several times to create a composition of several colors. John's film, Arabesque, was released in 1975. If you want to know more about John Whitney's work, he summarized his theories on computer graphics and visual music in this book called Digital Harmony. When I agreed to program Arabesque, I did so under one condition, that I could use the computers at III for my own work. Whitney had been granted access to the III computers to make his film. He wasn't sure if that could be extended to include my film. He said he thought it would be okay, but just in case, if anyone should ask, I should tell him I was one of his sons. If impersonating one of John's sons was the price of admission, I was okay with it. Fortunately, no one asked. Since we saw Two-Space already, now let's see how it was made. For Two-Space, I got to use the same film plotter we'd used for Arabesque, but for my film, I needed more compute power than just the little computer that was in the plotter. So I used their mainframe computer, PDP-10, and this is how the process worked. I used the storage tube display for editing and previewing my programs, which produced the data tapes full of drawing commands, which I then took over to the film plotter for filming. Then I ran the film through their film processor for developing, and ran the developed film through the Moviola, where I could see the results of my experiments. This whole process is basically the same as I had at JPL, except that at III, I was able to operate all of this equipment myself. I didn't have to drive across town, and I didn't have to wait a week to see the results. I kept making tapes and plotting them onto film all night, and then in the morning, before everyone came into work, I pulled the film from the camera for processing and viewing. So in this situation, I got to see one roll of film at the end of each day. And this was a big improvement over the situation I had at JPL, where I only got to see one roll of film per week. As many of you know, this turnaround time is important for an experimental filmmaking because the design of the film is not determined at the start. The design emerges from a series of experiments, and sometimes it takes a lot of experimenting to get to the final film. Even though this process had been sped up from my time at JPL by a factor of 7, progress at III still seemed slow to me. While I was working on Two-Space, I got wind of another computer graphics system at a university in Chicago. That system was capable of producing animation in real time. On a real-time system, I could see the results of my experiments immediately without having to wait for cameras, film, and processing on all of that. That sounded pretty good. I was happy with the animation I was producing at III, but I was not happy with the slow pace. When I saw all the work flowing out of Chicago, I became envious of how quickly animation could be produced there. Then I got an idea. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to take a little break from III and check out this real-time system in Chicago. I could always come back to LA later and pick up where I left off. So I put Two-Space on hold while I went to Chicago to work on their real-time system. The film that I made there is called 378. Let's look at it first, and then we can look at the real-time system used. So, how did I hear about this system in Chicago? Whitney showed me a copy of his PhD thesis by a student at Ohio State by the name of Tom DeFonte. The thesis was about a special programming language that DeFonte had developed. It was designed specifically for non-engineers to learn programming and produce animation with a simple, direct syntax. He called the system the Graphics Symbiosis System, or GRASS for short. When I caught up with DeFonte, he was teaching at the University of Illinois, an urban campus near downtown Chicago. DeFonte's lab was in the chemistry department in this building. To give you an idea of what the GRASS system was like, here's a video of DeFonte demonstrating his system in 1976.
To give you a little cook's tour of this laboratory in the chemistry department, we'll take you over the computer here. This single bay houses the graphics computer, and this down here, of course, is the PDP-1145 computer. Behind this panel is 28,000 words of memory. This here is the disk drive, the mass storage medium we use to hold pictures and macros and other information used to run the graphic system. Up here is the A to D converters, which allow us to use dials and knobs and sliders and other things to control images. From the computer's memory go wires that go over to the Vector General. And as you can see, the Vector General is capable of putting up images in real time, rotating them around. What we do there is point TV cameras at them. Little TV cameras like this, which you can move around and center and get different parts of the screen. Now, the single thing that's hardest to communicate in a paper like this is the interactivity of the system. For instance, anything that can be controlled in the system can be controlled through the use of slide potentiometers or dials, like these. What we're going to do now is show you how we make up simple objects like this. But first, you can see the room lights reflecting in the screen, so we normally work with the room lights off. The room lights are actually still off. What we've done here is put up some infrared lights, and CrossEye over there has an infrared sensitive camera, so we can show you the working environment of the room while we're actually doing things and still get high quality video without the room lights. The regular TV cameras are not sensitive to infrared light. First thing we have to do to show you how we make this little flying starch molecule is restart the system. We're also superimposing the VTO5's type on the screen. We get the starch molecule up, and we get the propeller from the disk. The first thing anyone does with propellers is rotate them. But that appears to be the wrong axis. The system is very good in letting you know when you're wrong right away. Now we want to attach the propeller to the front of the starch molecule, so we have to move it. That's easily done. However, we have a problem with the z-dimension because we can't see it here. On this display, you can only see z-axis information when the object is rotating. So what we're going to do now is group these two things. And we're going to call it Dan. Grouping allows you to manipulate both objects independently and as a group. So we're going to rotate so we can get z-axis here. And as expected, the z is not lined up. So we move it over like that. Now, no matter how hard we wiggle this, the propeller will not come off. Now we want to get it back to that kind of elliptical orbit we had before. So we'll use a multi-dial rotate. In this case, we're going to use the slider pods. And it's not quite arranged properly on the screen, so rather than move the TV cameras, we're just going to move the object. This time on the tablet. And it's a little too big, so I think we'll scale it down. Dial 1. So we have complete control like we had before of speed and things like that.
In this demo, you saw how each command of the GRASS language made a connection between one of the dials and a transformation, like moving or rotating. And then once that connection was made, Tom could perform the animation live just by turning the dials. But I wasn't interested in performing animation live. I was interested in the algorithmic generation of images. So how could I control the transformations from within the program? Fortunately, GRASS had something called time-based variables. With time-based variables, you could specify a target value and the time you wanted the parameter to take to reach that target. With time-based variables, I was able to score a continuous sequence of precise transformations from within the program instead of using the dials at all. So there was no film plotter in Chicago. So for filming, I had to set up an animation camera in front of the monitor. But with real-time animation, I could see my experiments as they worked. So I only needed to shoot the final film when it was finished. The computer could display the whole 6-minute film in real time, and the camera just recorded it onto film. So with 378 done, now what? Back to III to finish 2-Space, right? Wrong. Unfortunately, the situation at III had changed. I couldn't get back in. While I was away, they created a division within III for producing special effects for feature films. This new division was monopolizing all the computer systems, and there wasn't any after-hours time available for my project. Since I couldn't make any new animation with Two-Face, I had to work with the experiments I had already filmed 2 years earlier. From those experiments, I pulled together several scenes, added the soundtrack, and just finished Two-Space as best I could with what I had. After Two-Space was released, I had nowhere I could work. I was between computers. The IBM PC had come out, but it had no graphics capabilities. In its first incarnation, it's alphanumeric only. Then, finally, the first computer came on the market that was both powerful enough for my animation work and affordable enough for me to own. At last, I could work at home in my studio without needing patronage from any institution. The first film I made on this system is called Calculated Movements. Again, let's look at the film first, and then we'll look at the system. Question is, where did this new system come from? Oddly enough, it was the Bally Corporation. Bally was known primarily for pinball machines, but when it started making video arcade games, it developed a special graphics processor, and then it also used this GPU in a video game system for the home, the Bally Arcade. At the same time, my old friend Tom DeFonte of Chicago, he wanted his GRASS language to reach more artists than just a few who could use his graphics lab on campus. So he teamed up with the members of the Bally's R&D group to produce a personal graphics machine based on their new GPU. It was called the UV1. The GRASS language that Defanti originally wrote for that expensive vector graphics hardware was rewritten to run on the small processor inside the UV1. That processor chip was called the Z80, so this new version of GRASS became known as ZGRASS. Here's the ZGRASS system in my studio in Santa Cruz. The UV1 with its row of LEDs is on the bottom shelf. On the upper shelf, you have the alphanumeric terminal for programming on the left, and next to it, a video monitor for the graphics. This system marked the transition from vector graphics to the pixel-based raster graphics. The cost of memory had come down enough such that an entire image could be stored in memory as an array of pixels. But hard drives, on the other hand, were still too expensive. The only external storage on this system was a floppy drive. The floppy disks were removable, but held only 600K of data, enough for storing programs, but not big enough to hold even a single frame of animation. So each frame was recorded onto film. I set up a camera in front of a little video monitor, controlled the camera from the UV1, and I had a homemade film plotter. Even though this system had a special GPU for speeding up the graphics operations, it was still a microcomputer and very, very slow. A single frame of calculated movements took 2 minutes to compute and draw. There are 1,440 frames in a minute of film. At 2 minutes per frame, that comes to 48 hours of computing to produce 1 minute of screen time. So to produce the whole 6-minute film, working around the clock, the UV1 finished the job in just 12 days. And that's just for the final 6-minute film. Because I made hundreds of short experiments along the way, the whole production stretched out over a period of 2.5 years. At least it was finished in time to premiere at the Computer Graphics Conference in San Francisco in 1985, the SIGGRAPH Conference. The premiere screening was held in the Herbst Theater of the San Francisco Museum of Art. Well, that's it for my personal history of computer animation and graphics technology. Today, there's no need for a special graphics computer like the UV1. There are plenty of powerful graphics cards available for the standard PC. I was working on such a system in 2010, but before I could finish the film, it suffered a serious crash that I couldn't recover from. I have some animation experiments from that unfinished project, which we can look at in a minute. But first, I want to thank you all for coming.